I would love to know some really successful story or stories or examples of
Right.
organizations which have or blended finance, where it's worked. In India, ideally, I'm assuming it's already worked in India.
Absolutely. I mean, so in impact investing, the examples are too numerous to list. Often, I mean, I just say that some of these are paper unicorns because they're not actually earning profits. They just have a valuation of $1 billion. But look at the example of microfinance companies. Several of these erstwhile MFIs have now become small finance banks. Names like Jana Lakshmi, Ujjivan, Satin Credit Care. These are banks with billion-dollar balance sheets and so on, which started off in 2005, 2007, when I was at low capital, we invested in many of these companies. So microfinance is by far the most successful impact investing success story. It took up almost half the capital in the industry. And then in the real economy, think about any sector with the word affordable in front of it. Affordable education or low-cost private schools, where many of the children of our maids and drivers go to school. They're paying a fee of 1,000 rupees or something per month, but those schools are making profits. Affordable housing, and so on. So that's impact investing. In blended finance, blending means taking public and philanthropic capital to subsidize private capital to reduce the cost of debt. The two most beautiful examples there are during COVID. So, for example, there's something known as the Samridh Healthcare Facility, which is giving low-cost debt. It was set up during COVID to healthcare startups who are focusing on different healthcare interventions, who need low-cost debt, and the banks or NBFCs simply would not give it to them without some kind of a subsidy.
Sure.
So that is one example where enterprises are getting it. And outcomes finance, like I said, there haven't been too many impact bonds in India, but that's changing. The very first impact bond is something that I think your viewers would be interested in knowing. It's called Educate Girls. It's an NGO in Rajasthan run by a wonderful lady called Safina Hussain, which encourages parents to send their girls to school. Rajasthan has a huge problem with many girls being out of school. So this NGO literally visits people's homes, encourages them to send their girls to school through various means, and then of course tracks the learning outcomes and helps improve them in those schools. This NGO was the recipient of India's very first social impact bond, which was funded by people like UBS, the famous Swiss bank.
Right.
And UBS would give them the money to do the intervention. And once it was established that, let's say, X percentage of girls are going to school and their learning outcomes are such and such, then the outcome funder, which was SIF, Children's Investment Fund, again, a huge, large global foundation, they would pay back the UBS investors with a rate of interest. And the rate of interest is commensurate to the social outcomes achieved. So if Educate Girls does a fantastic job, they learn, let's say, 8% interest. If they do a mediocre job, they'll earn 4% interest. And if the NGO fails, they lose their money. That's why it's called a social impact bond or a development impact bond. So imagine that the power of that. Rather than giving your philanthropy away, you're investing in a social project and generating a return for that. Now, if that became standardized, would you put your money in a fixed deposit to earn a few interest, or would you put your money in a project which would, help underprivileged people, and you would literally get an interest rate for that?
That's so 8% is anyways more than an FD.
So there are a lot of examples which we can share.
But what qualifies an organization to receive a social impact bond?
I mentioned the limitations earlier.
Yes, that you did.
So those are limitations overall at an industry level.
Yes.
Those are reasons why the market hasn't fully taken off yet, because impact is not standardized. It took a lot of actors to come together and structure this UBS bond, large organizations, big consulting firms. There's 7 or 8 major actors active in this space right now. I should name some of them because these are pioneering foundations. The Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, the British Asia Trust, SIF itself. Now, building on the success of Educate Girls, and UBS, of course, these organizations have worked together to create development impact bonds in education, in skilling, which are much larger and which involve multiple NGOs. So collectively amongst themselves, British Asia Trust, Dell Foundation, and UBS, amongst others, have created a vast ecosystem of education and skilling focused impact bonds. Folks like me, when I was at Asha Impact and now at DNA, we have been focusing on impact bonds in agriculture and livelihoods. And we're developing India's first social impact bond. Just in terms of nomenclature, a DIB is when a foundation pays, like SIF. So it's still private money. A SIB, or social impact bond, is when a government pays. We've never had a SIB in India. Now there's a large state government in India, which I should not reveal the name of it, but it's one of the largest states in India, has mandated us and others to develop India's first SIB. So we're developing development programs for the state where the private sector and the NGOs are going to go out there and do programs like the Lakpati Didi initiative, which Mrs. Sitaraman announced in the last budget, increase the scope of that in healthcare, in rural livelihoods, in tribal affairs, in social justice. And if these programs are successful, the state government will pay for them.
Central government is going to pay for these
A
ones.
state government. It's a state level program. Because a government could be a local government, it could be a state government, and hopefully eventually one day it'll be the central government as well. So an NGO which is already struggling cannot expect a social impact bond to suddenly save it.
Absolutely.
It's a useful tool for scaling your work, for trying out new innovations. And if you already have some credibility, some scale, and some proof points. So it's an additional aspect which comes after you achieve basic scale.
Right.
And of course, those industry level factors remain: defining impact, the difficult cost of intermediation, the lack of awareness of donors in this. Often donors just prefer traditional forms of financing.
Right.
There's a new firm which has just come up, which is doing fabulous work here, called the India Blended Finance Company, TBFC, which is hoping to address many of these market bottlenecks by standardizing templates, creating what are called rate cards for impact, and really catalyzing this market, mobilizing donors. Larger consulting firms that are well known, like Dahlberg, like Bridgespan, like even McKinsey, all of them are working on this. So the hope is that, like impact investing was at an inflection point in 2007. There were only 5 impact funds when I started in this industry. Now there's 55 members of the IIC and 800 registered AIFs. And Mr. Kant and others have said, every firm an ESG, every firm an impact fund, so every VC firm. Impact investing is quite mainstream now. Similarly, we have a vision that blended finance and outcome finance will go through a similar trajectory till, let's say, 2030, 2035. And frankly, it's necessary if India is going to meet its development objectives. We have these SDG targets in 2030, right? And we hope to be a developed country by 2047. It's not going to happen if we don't unlock the private capital to complement the government capital and to make both of those capitals more effective. And blended finance and outcomes finance promise that. So they certainly have a role to play. And it could also be thought of as a transitional role, that you move from grant-based funding to purely commercial funding, and blending offers you a way to do that.
Right. But I have a question for you. I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs, obviously, on the show. And I think the one thing that quite a few of them have mentioned, that the corporatization of, funding and
Right.
this entire template formation, it kind of takes away from the long-term outcomes. Like everybody is expecting short-term outcomes.
Right.
And that's when they get funding, because everybody is hoping to see some change happen right now in 2 years. But the change will actually happen over years, right? It might happen over 10 years, right? I mean, especially when you're working with little children, right?
Correct.
Or even health. How does that work, in terms of, these are systemic changes. These are not small changes, right?
In blended finance and outcome finance, typically the contracts are 3 years. And you're right. It depends on whether that's considered long or not. Typical grant contracts, especially from CSR, are 1 year. So the whole benefit of blended and outcome finance, arguably, is that at least it's longer. You're being given three years. It could also be 5 years to show incremental improvements over those years. But you're right. In some development programs, the overall effect may take even longer. So then you may have to just break it down in terms of the outputs, the distinction between outputs and outcomes. So it just involves the specificity of what the exact intervention is, and these challenges of tenure, of matching the tenure of the financing to the needs of the program,
Right.
Do remain. It's something that has to be grappled with in the structuring of these projects and transactions.
Makes sense. So Kartik, blended finance, clearly can be a game changer. But what is the way that you can actually ensure that, social entrepreneurs, impact organizations, and potential funders are all on the same page about it, all comfortable with this idea? They are, aware, at ease. How can this be done?
Thank you for asking that, because that's precisely the need of the hour. And that's precisely what I have been focused on. And I'm very proud of that, both when I was at Asha Impact, because we had a fund, but we also had a not-for-profit think tank, which did market building and ecosystem building. And at DNA, we spend more than 50% of our time on this. It's very difficult work. It's completely non-remunerative. I need to mention that. So there needs to be grant support for this as well. There's industry associations that also do this, which we collaborate with, the Impact Investors Council, the AVPN, various others. But what I'm trying to say is that there's a tremendous need for policy advocacy and market building because it's Sarkar, Samaj, Bazaar, right? You have these three segments. The NGOs, that's Samaj. You have the government, which is Sarkar, which has different components to it. And you have investors. And you have different types of investors. You have both for-profit investors and not-profit investors, foundations and donors. You need to bring them all together and in different ways. So you need different tracks. You need a track to engage with different donors. So those donors who have been active, like some of which I mentioned earlier, are trying to encourage new donors, the large names in India,
Right.
the RIL foundations, the SBI foundations, and those conversations are happening to get those donors involved. Commercial investors have a different perspective, so they have to be talked to. Roundtables need to be held, memos need to be created for them. Policymakers, there's so many different segments of them. There's the thinking element of policy, which is the Niti Aayog, the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, which kind of creates overall policy. And then there's technical aspects to policy, which is SEBI or RBI or the Ministry of Finance. There's so many different policy discussions that are happening. And again, very few firms are doing this. And finally, there's a capacity building side on the NGO side, the kind of questions you asked. NGOs are curious about how do we enter this space.
Right.
Large NGOs who have done impact bonds, their knowledge needs to be shared with the smaller NGOs. So collectively, this involves doing publications, doing research, putting that research out for free, holding convenings, disseminating data, educating people at universities, creating educational technology content.
Right.
And all of that is collectively known as market building. There is no one market building entity.
Sure.
I'm very passionate about this because I've been doing this not just at Desai and Associates, but throughout my career, right? If you look up a show called The Real Deal, it was a predecessor to Shark Tank, which we had been involved in. It was just for impact investors.
Right.
Living My Promise, who you've covered.
Right.
There's so many people working on developing and catalyzing this ecosystem. All of us work together. Parinam, which is the outcomes-based financing collective action platform, was mobilizing over 35 players who work in the space, over 500 NGOs, and 7 or 8 key policymakers. So that is the only way. And my appeal to anyone watching this program or others is that this type of work really needs strategic sponsorship and funding. Right. Donors are very happy to give to specific activities, but to build the ecosystem, to support the research, to support the convenings, that is also where much support is needed. And that's how this ecosystem will go forward.
I mean, it's a lot of work, that's required. And, I always, again, coming back to information is power, right? Because when everybody's informed, they feel more confident about taking certain decisions, and
Absolutely.
This is a matter of money and outcomes. So Kartik, what is your vision for this, for, where you would like this to go, this entire idea of blended finance at Desai and Associates, how you would like to take this forward?
I think it's way beyond Desai and Associates. A collective vision that many of us in the industry have is exactly how we saw the growth of impact investing to become mainstream, that blended finance actually plays a role over the next 15 years in bringing the development and the private capital that's needed for India. We have these SDG targets in 2023, which we're not on track to meet. The estimates are that billions and even trillions of dollars are needed globally, and a large percentage of that is needed in our country to achieve those targets. So you have to unlock that private capital, and the capital has to be used effectively. So my vision is that will actually start to happen, that blended finance will start to get mainstream. And the proof is, again, my own journey in impact investing that I've been fortunate to see over the last 25 years or so, that when impact investing started, there were only 5 funds.
Right.
Now there's so many more. And so even though it seems a bit idealistic and naive, I feel that there is a lot of action, there's a lot of activity, the awareness is increasing, the government is open to it, and most of all, I feel that we basically have no choice, that the need is so stark, given the challenges that our country is facing of this V-shaped growth, right? Of tremendous economic growth and our trajectory towards being a developed country, whilst incredible poverty, deprivation, suffering, pollution, prejudice, etc., is actually not just at a status quo, but increasing. And we cannot survive as a nation, as a society, with that sort of a gap. So there is no other way.
It's like 2 Indias.
So this is the solution to that. So that's my vision, that effectively blended finance becomes mainstream, investors come in, the money starts to get pumped in, and these beautiful organizations working on the ground on the different activities to help the most underprivileged people of our country get the funding that they deserve.
Thank you so much, Kartik. It was indeed a pleasure, knowing so much about blended finance, about innovative finance. And, I feel far more confident about maybe if I have to discuss it with somebody, I would be able to. So thanks a lot. And I'm sure our audience really appreciates it.
Thank you so much, Aparna.